For the individuals that don't know me, I'm Terry Surjan. I'm in the design faculty and the visual studies, electronic media faculty here at SCI-Arc. Before I introduce SHoP, the New York architectural firm that's come for tonight's lecture, I'd just like to take a minute and talk a little bit about what happened over the last 10 days at SCI-Arc in terms of NAB. And I was talking to Rose and Tim and Tom, who were also on the NAB exhibition committee. And I was trying to think of something to say in terms of what occurred. Basically what happened, at least in a story that maybe could be told, is that I was thinking about it, and everybody knows who Michael Jordan is, right? Basketball player, all this stuff. But the thing I remember about Michael Jordan is that he was the first player in athletics to have a love of the game clause put into his contract, which basically means he could play basketball whenever he wanted to without being paid or a risk of injury. So last week, I guess, in a real quick introduction, I would say that I realized, as I'm sure the rest of SCI-Arc and the rest of the sort of staff, faculty, and students have for many years, that a love of the game clause has always been part of SCI-Arc. So I guess from the NAB committee, et cetera, we really want to say a heartfelt, thank you to everyone. To begin to introduce SHoP, basically in the last few years here at SCI-Arc, lectures and symposiums have taken place that have spoken of new forms and ways of architectural practice. Tonight, a relatively young architecture firm from New York, SHoP, will also address multiple issues concerning these new forms of architectural practice. This is not to say that they, SHoP, are an e-practice, but one which mixes both the digital and the physical. A workshop coexists in the office with the computers. So these elements continually mix into a series of projects that I would say vary greatly in scale, materials, and conceptual rigor. SHoP, which stands for Sharples, Holden, and Pasquarelli, was established in 1994. It's taken a few different configurations over the time, but fundamentally the same individuals are there. At the very core of the firm, this is probably one of the most important principles of the firm. The 5 individuals come from extremely different backgrounds. And I'm saying this not because of their architectural degrees, which all come, or their master's degrees, which all come from Columbia University, but the range of degrees they've received as undergraduates. The 5 individuals which make up SHoP, which is basically a husband and wife, 2 husband and wife teams, plus a twin brother, which will, of course, make for a really good story someday, hold degrees in art history, commerce and finance, history, fine arts, and engineering. This diversity is a database which SHoP relies on a daily basis, and of course, according to Greg and others, their experience from everyone from Frank Gehry to Greg Lynn to Richard Meyer to the City Corporation have also become invaluable for their architectural practice. And by the way, the 5 principals in SHoP are Chris Sharples, Bill Sharples, Corey Sharples, Kim Holden, and Gregg Pasquarelli. So to sort of make it short and sweet, to get to the numbers of all of this, over the last 5 years, SHoP has taught, lectured, and or exhibited at the following: Tokyo University, Rhode Island School of Design, Parsons, Pratt, Columbia, Yale University, Penn State, Harvard Graduate School of Design, RPI, and the Van Allen Institute. Over the same period of time, SHoP has placed in 10 national or international competitions, placing first in 4 and second in 2 of the 10 competitions. Most notably, they won what was in 1996 the waterfront revitalization for Greenport, Long Island, New York, and SHoP placed second in the COMA, which is the Korean Museum of Art competition that was held here in Los Angeles in 1995. Also in terms of design awards, SHoP just last year received the Progressive Architecture Award citation for the Museum of Sex project in New York City, which they will speak about tonight. In 1991, I met both Greg and Chris for the first time. They are 2 of the 5 from SHoP which have come from New York to lecture tonight. So let's welcome some old friends and hopefully some new friends of SCI-Arc SHoP.
Well, thank you very much, Terry, and thanks to the to Neil and to the committee for having us out here today. Yeah, it's usually I have to explain that it's 2 husbands and wives and a twin brother, which makes up 5 partners. And since there are 9 people in the office, we're about the most top-heavy firm there is in architecture today. Also, some people are calling us the ABBA of architecture, which I guess is okay, because it's better than being the Fleetwood Mac, as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, I guess the way that we'd like to just sort of talk about what we're trying to do, and we're going to show you 3 projects tonight. And the idea is just to show a kind of work in progress, and to let you in on the way that we're trying to think through things. And by no means is it a kind of final understanding of things, and that it's about an exploration, and we don't really know what the end is at this point, certainly. But rather than focusing upon a vocabulary of pliant and reconfigurable forms, our office is researching a procedural agenda or practice that is pliant and reconfigurable. We believe that constructs of architecture respond by degrees to different influences and forces present in their environment. Our research on the generation of space and form has led to the development of systems that can be configured to address and respond to variable influences of context. Here, a new definition of context must be used. One that brings in social, temporal, legislative, financial, physical influences that prepare a thickened membrane within which an architectural intrusion can be inserted. Each project attempts to develop a methodology of insertion and to create a conceptual engine supple enough to respond to and to react to external forces while maintaining the project's integrity. And that's the most important thing to us, and we hope that we can start to show you how we've tried to set up this thickened membrane, how different kinds of forces come into play with the way we're developing the space, and how this kind of responsive methodology can absorb different kinds of influences but maintain a project's integrity. And then, as Terry was saying, to sort of further that, we use the computer, but we're continually bringing the computer, we're bringing the designs in and out of the computer so that it's developed in the computer and it's quickly built in model. We study it in model, and we quickly put it back in the computer. And it's in that play that we think we're starting to come up with ways that we can, you know, actually build some of the forms that we're designing. So if we could have the first
can we have the first slides? And I can walk away. You guys can hear me, right? All right. So we're going to present 3 projects tonight to sort of talk about what Gregg just spoke about. And the first project being the one that's now under construction for the village of Greenport on the North Fork of Long Island. It's a waterfront development project that's centered around what we see here, this vacant lot, which is now going to be the village center, the park. And the working waterfront that still has wharfs and commercial facilities. Next slides, please.
I think I have the thing. Hold on.
Oh, you got that.
Is that it? We got one. Let's go back.
No, go back. Yeah, right there.
There we go.
So these diagrams here were sort of how the project first started, was to take into consideration some of these forces that Gregg was just discussing and start mapping them out in terms of the existing condition, which is basically, this is the site that was given us in the competition. And understanding the relationships of certain forces, some of them in terms of the boaters, the idea that there was going to be a new marina and that this was a working waterfront, the relationships to certain views, vectoral relationships, commercial effects. This is the commercial wharves here, the pressures on the site from this direction, the village itself, and then in certain areas, which you probably see in the next few slides, that there's 2 ferries from Shelter Island and the Long Island Railroad, which connects here. And so the idea is that there's day tourists who would be wanting to occupy this site. And over here, you see some of the impacts of the flooding on the site that we have to deal with raising some of it in order to protect some of the program, and in certain cases the shoreline as well. Over here what you see is basically all these forces layered to create a blended front, understanding that there's a number of people that are going to be coming from over here, from the ferries, the commercial center, and then from the village, and then also understanding where these areas might start to collect.
Let me see, I still have this backwards.
No, this one's good.
There we go. Okay, so there are several programs that were required as part of the competition. A carousel house for an antique carousel that the town owned, a seasonal rink that could be an ice skating rink in the winter, a harbor walk that would be a promenade that people could walk along the water, some kind of water garden element, an amphitheater, the ferry terminal, a small harbor master house, shade arbors, and water basins. And we started to think about what the kind of original provisional positioning of these elements would be as they related to other contexts in the town, and started to work in their positioning with this kind of blended front, this kind of thickened membrane that we were talking about. And here you see a diagram that's starting to sort of locate these kind of creod-like basins that begin to allow us to insert program and sort of take into play forces and kind of ways that the site could be used.
And some of these programs, for example, the rink was not part of the original parameters, and some of the political forces that also were brought into consideration as a result of federal funds also had an effect on how things started to move around on the site.
And so what you see here now is a kind of final plan that begins to show you the kinds of connections. This piece of property here actually wasn't part of the original site, but our kind of simulations kept wanting to make a connection over here. And after we did receive the commission, the town is now in the process of purchasing this land to add it to the park in total. So what you get is, here's the Long Island Railroad and the ferry from Shelter Island. You get this harbor walk that meanders around the site. You get an amphitheater that's built in that faces out to the water. You have the carousel house located here. And then this is a skating rink in the winter and a water garden during the summer. And then from some of the organizing principles, you see these kind of planks in the ground, and there are some more here, you can't see it at this scale, which are kind of a remnant of the forces that you saw in the previous slide that start to organize lighting and seating and other patterns. And we started to say that you're going to take, we're going to do a carousel house, and we wanted to say, well, how do we use the computer to take this kind of 19th century typology and reinvestigate it? And so we started to think, like, what were the really fun things about being on a merry-go-round? And one is obviously the nature of the motion of the horses as they go around, and the other one was this idea of the Doppler effect of your parents kind of yelling at you as you spin around and you go through. And so we modeled those two behaviors and we got these kind of general patterns that you see up here on the right. And what we did was we took these patterns, and these are all based on the same kind of simulations, and converted them into a kind of window glazing pattern that then could be converted actually into glass and steel doors to make the carousel house enclosure itself. What's interesting for us is, again, as we were saying, we immediately try and think of how we build it, that we can take the same kind of simulation and we can automatically build in a kind of value engineering system where these are the $200,000 set of doors, these are the $100,000 set of doors, and these are the $50,000 set of doors, and you could guess which one the client went for.
Since it was a federal project, you can guess which one it was.
So basically this kind of thing is simulated, and it's converted into 3 different glass patterns and then 3 different kinds of etched glass that get flipped and rotated, and what you end up with, if I can get the slide to work, is the carousel house, where you have 15-foot high by 15-foot wide bifold glass and steel doors that operate on a worm drive. Now the carousel is open, the water is right just to the south of the site, which you can see in the top of the left slide. The carousel is operated all year long, and it gets pretty cold out in Greenport. So it can be completely closed down, and you could probably get a temperature of about 50 or 60 degrees in there. And during the spring and summer, parts of it could be open, and during the summertime, it could be completely opened, and that can be adjusted. And what that does is, as you're moving around on the merry-go-round, you're seeing these patterns of the glass unfold, plus the direction as they open and close. There becomes this kind of blurred edge of what the building is itself.
Plus each door operates on its own worm drive system, so the building can actually take other shapes as a result.
And then very quickly again, we bring it right out into model, and we actually sequence precisely how this would be built. And these are part of our CDs. We actually built it in the order that the contractor would build it. We handed them a booklet, and so that we didn't have the local Greenport contractors freak out on us when they saw this, they really understood right away what they were trying to get into. And
so here you can see some of the details for the gutter. And we actually, sheeted the roof. This model was produced for along with the bid set. So there were 13 different builders invited to submit bids, and they looked at this model as part of the way that they would do their estimates, and they said it made a difference. Here you can see where the motor is for the worm drive, snuggled in between the downspout and one of the steel framings. That's the area for the downspout there.
And this is as of last fall, the construction process as it's going on, and it will be ready for this summer's season. And here you can see it under construction. So I think my pointer's dying. Here's the ferry landing. This is the piece of property that the town has now purchased. You can see the harbor walk going in, the carousel house. This is where the amphitheater is, and this is the contaminated soil that we're trying to get rid of off the site.
The contaminated soil.
And what you will see at the end here, you can see more clearly a kind of way that we're resolving that the original ambient blending, where there are these kind of patterns that are left over from that, and then they reveal themselves as light planks that create these kinds of shards of blue light that create a new kind of space that goes back into this sort of blended thickened membrane we were talking about. And you would see the mist garden in the distance that would also have these light planks coming up through it. So you can imagine a fog with these walls of blue light, and these walls of blue light as the villagers approach the carousel house on the left. The next project that we're going to talk to you about is called V-Mall, and it's a supermarket, 40 commercial stores, and parking for 200 people. And it's a sorry, I keep messing this up. It's a kind of program that it's something that's dealt with all the time. It's a typology that's looked at in any part of America. And we started to say, how could we start to think about this in a different way? Let me get to the next slide. So we started to think about this idea of thickened space. And we were really interested in this, when we were starting to talk about the blended, the ambient blending that was happening on Greenport. We started to really get involved in this idea of thickened space, and we started to wonder what that was about and how we could use it to sort of have a kind of performative effect on a design. So again, this is the typical, strip mall typology, and my thing is totally dead, Chris, so you're going to have to.
So yeah, the typical strip mall typology with a large parking lot in the front with all the stores on the perimeter of it. Since we were stuck with a very tight site, we basically had to stack 200-car parking garage, three levels below grade, along with the 2 levels of retail. So basically verticalized the standard strip. strip mall. And,
right. Okay. So what you're saying is that you have a site that's 6 times the size, and we have one time the size, and that here you have this kind of relationship in this typology, and that we wanted to try and develop this kind of relationship, and we started to think, how would we go about doing that? Because the real negative thing about being in one of this kind of configuration is you're in 3 levels of underground parking. It's dark, you can't orient yourself, sometimes you don't feel safe, especially in the neighborhood that this is going to be built in. And we said, well, how can the architecture, assist in developing a kind of new way for the owner to understand this sort of very simple diagram.
So you can see in the perspective that there's a very open transparency between where the cars enter down the express ramp, the parking garage opens up to the retail and supermarket spaces, and eventually to the skylights into the park beyond up in this upper picture.
So the site is on Northern Boulevard in Flushing, Queens, which is a main commercial artery. It's very close to LaGuardia Airport or Shea Stadium. Might be some landmarks that you may be familiar with. It's kind of 2-story low-rise commercial with 5-story residential sort of backing each side. It had one interesting thing. This building right here is the Queens Historical Society. And so there's a park here that's actually 1 level above the level of Northern Boulevard over here. And so here we just very provisionally blocked out all the programs and how they might work to start to see what kinds of connections we could do, how this idea of thickened space might help us to overcome the kinds of effects that we were faced with in developing this project. And we looked to the computer right away because we said, well, let's see what we could do with the idea of surfaces. We wanted to see, by using surfaces, what kinds of forms, what kind of new space we could get that would give you this kind of blurred, thickened zone that would be at the same time a kind of orientation space, so that when you drove the car or you approached by foot, and it's about equal the number of people that approach by car or by foot, you would immediately know where you were. You would immediately know how to navigate yourself through the building. You would be able to get light down through the building so that when you were in the garage, you would see which way was out. But at the same time, because of the level changes and because you're loading retail on 3 different levels, 1 level in the basement, at ground level, and the park level, we wanted to kind of blur that distinction of where you were inside the building so that you wouldn't have any kind of second-class space. There wouldn't be any retail that would feel that it was not as valuable as ground floor retail.
So you see here, this is almost diagrammatically reflecting what's eventually being developed in the cage model, is where the express ramp for the car would be, the relationship of the supermarket and how it opens up into that void space and eventually leads you to the upper level of retail.
And again, this idea of a responsive sleeve, it became a structural system right away that we could reconfigure in order to have the program and these kinds of spatial effects occur, so that it was a model, but it was not a kind of stiff model or one based on image, rather than on a kind of effect or the way that we wanted the space to behave. And so as we then started to look at this in place with the rest of the building and cutting sections through that, we started to understand the way in which these surfaces could unfold, the kinds of programs that could insert themselves there, and we started to look at opportunities for bringing light in, for the way that the cars and the people would move through the building, and for its relationship to the other program in the other part of the building. Oops.
And what's nice about those drawings and these models is that we are actually not making approximations with the engineering. These are, we can actually pass this information on to Bureau Happel, who are our engineers, and run the calculations for these forms.
Basically, we just take the wire frames and hand them to our engineers and ask them to size it. Sometimes they're happy with that.
Sometimes.
So what you start to get is this kind of zone. It's basically 3 levels of parking underground, and then you have the big this is a cafe level on the ground, on the basement level. There's a big supermarket that floats in here, and then there's retail space above. But the key element is this whole sort of central zone where these forms are developed that actually act and respond to what's happening around and try and have this kind of effect that we're talking about with making this kind of central blurred thickened zone. And as what's happening on the inside begins to unfold as these different, here's a ramp that's actually on the surface of a wall, or an escalator that floats up between the two and gets wrapped by another surface here, or it's a surface that comes along that hides mechanical equipment and skylights here, becomes actually small kiosk shops over here, like ear-piercing huts or eyeglass shops, and then wraps around the front and becomes the front main signage for the building. It sort of becomes both this orienting device and this kind of blurred device as well. And as it unfolds onto the building itself, it starts to become the pieces that wrap the mechanical systems and wrap the security grills and wrap the elevator cores and the bulkheads.
So here in this you could see that blue wrap, how it frames the skylights here and then moves along the whole interior, the kiosk space, as Greg was saying, and then becomes the signage for the building. Basically pulls you all the way through to the park, or from the park all the way through to the Northern Boulevard side.
And then again, very quickly, we tried to think about how would we make this. So we've got this form in the computer, but we really want to try and test it. So we started to think about ways that we could laser cut out bay systems, joist systems, hang them from the ceiling, make the rotations, allow the kind of dropping of the skylights in. And this was a kind of early idea of a shingling system that could be used to make this kind of metal surface for that wrapper piece that you saw that went through the entire building. And at the same time, we started to look at, again, just like in the Greenport project, a pre-value engineering idea where here's the same wrapper geometry, but here it's at 2-foot panels, 1-foot panels, 6-inch panels, and 3-inch panels. So you can see that it's the same controlling geometry, but we have a built-in way of trying to help us with our budget. On this hand, these are the exterior pieces where we basically use an unfold diagram, and then we give this to our roofing contractors, who are able to not only price it much more accurately, but even order the material more accurately and use it in fabrication as well.
And in that case also, we can give them the computer files so that they could mill it directly. Here you have the plans, the lower cafe plans as you come down the speed ramp, the drop off. Up here you have the main level of the supermarket opening up into the vertical space here. There you see the speed ramp. On the roof we have a miniature golf course, and on the second floor we have leasable retail space. So here you can see the connection with the park. So in most cases we can make the assumption that the adults will stay in this area and most of the children will continue up to the roof and learn how to play golf.
And then the elevations of the building, so the front elevation where you can see the main sign, and this kind of idea of compressing both the car entry and the pedestrian entry together under the sign in this kind of crack in the front of the building. Loading docks, you have your retail stores above, which would then put signage on these steel grates up here. This would be is going to be a bank on the first floor. And from the park elevation, there's a terrace because of this setback that's required by zoning code. So we plant that so it seems like an extension of the park, but that this element here kind of marks an entry for people who want to walk and cut through the park to get there. And then on the sides where we're building right to the building line, it's just two basically blank facades. But when you are up on the roof playing miniature golf, you get this kind of clerestory that opens up and allows you to see how the whole building went together. And basically here you have an idea where, again, you see the key element is this idea of bringing both the pedestrians and the cars together, that they enter into the same space. It's not a separate element, so that when you drive in or walk in, either way, you immediately understand the section of the building, you're oriented as far as knowing how to move through the building, but there's this kind of thickened blending that occurs with the different use of materials and different translucencies and transparencies that kind of blurs the way in which you're understanding what floor you're actually on.
I think, yeah.
The third project that we want to show you tonight is the Museum of Sex. And you know, it was pretty interesting to have a client come to you with this fantastic idea. You know, they said, well, I'm sure you've been to Amsterdam and I'm sure you've been to erotica museums. This isn't what we want to do. We really want to make a cultural institution that very seriously looks at sex and its role in culture and looks at it in an intelligent way. And they had all these great ideas for what the shows might be, and a really great plan. They owned a building site. They were really very together. Their one question was, we have no idea what a museum of sex should look like. So we didn't really either, except for the fact that we didn't want a big tower and we didn't want a big cave. And so we figured, okay, well, let's just start to approach it with a really open mind. And so we started to look at those forms, but we started to look at those forms in a different way, where we were looking at materials, we were looking at art, we were looking at light.
Textures. No.
Textures. We were looking at places of sex. We were looking at sensuality. We were looking at the body and the body in space. And that was really the thing that started to catch us, was this idea of the body in space. And we started to say that was something that was very interesting to us, because we didn't think that this should be about a kind of bifurcating model of male or female or straight or gay or spectator or participant, but really about this kind of inclusive but ambiguous relationship where there's a kind of unknown about what sex is and what a space about sex would be like. So the site is on Fifth Avenue. So the Empire State Building being here, the Flatiron Building here. This is Madison Square Park, and it's on the corner of 27th and 5th, which is an interesting site, because this whole area is sort of the extension of the Silicon Alley development coming up from the bottom, and the Empire State Building is kind of the lowest point on the tourist trail. So you have 3.5 million tourists sitting right at that corner every year, and you have lots of web-based companies and great little shops kind of moving up this way, and we were sort of in the no man's land between. And it was a difficult site. It's only 30 feet wide here and 125 feet long here. So this is the 27th Street side, this is the 5th Avenue side, and then it has this funny little appendage that sticks back into the block.
And it already told us in just the first beginning analysis of diagram that the circulation would have to be incorporated somehow within that very narrow footprint.
So immediately we started to look at the way in which we would approach this, and we started to say, you know, we don't want the image of what we were talking about, but we want the kind of performative value. We wanted this kind of responsive methodology, something that we could kind of feed the requirements of what the museum had to do and how it would perform, to see if we could find a form and a materiality that would aid in that kind of effect. So what you see here is, this is really the site and plan. And this being 5th Avenue, this is 27th Street, and these are different kinds of programmatic requirements of the building. This big fat red line is actually the 3.5 million tourists, 1/2 of which they're hoping to attract down Fifth Avenue, the few blocks, there's a kind of different behavior along the side street. There's different requirements for the building code as far as locating, exiting. There's different kind of forces as far as where we could load our mechanical systems, solar gain issues, just width of exiting and egressing, and then the amount of actual exhibition space in and of itself. And so these are stills from animations that we had made, where it goes from this idea of just sort of flat planes and then planes that are responding to all of these issues as they shift and intensify. And again, the same idea in section, where you have sort of provisional flat planes set up here, and then as they shift and intensify, as they kind of react and respond to these kinds of influences that are present in their environment.
So basically, these are just abstract models that are developing a menu of understanding the different sort of forces and parameters that we know we have to deal with on this project.
And so here again you can see, this is now in Axon, what we just saw in plan and section, the sort of we actually put 4 basic bays, and then we stacked extra bays on the front because we knew that there was something very intense about the zone between the inside and the outside of the museum. And so by just loading up some extra surfaces as we started this, it afforded us more opportunity to make more specific decisions on that kind of front edge of this thickened space. So here you see it sort of at the beginning stage, and here it is at its most agitated stage. And that led us to these forms, which was this point where we really started to see this idea of not a skin, but of a thickened space that allowed for all of these kinds of programs to work within this kind of provisional model. And we then furthered that back to the way that we were thinking about the idea of sexuality, where it was not only about these kinds of forms, but also something that developed into a structure, something that developed into a materiality, and something that went back to this idea of how you would actually use this building and what kinds of effects one would get by being in here.
So these models here were actually taken from this model was first developed, and we found that certain things weren't working. It was remaining too flat. We went back into the computer, and the previous drawings, the alias animations, we were able to construct each individual section, which gave us the prior framing system. So which shows how we're sort of also going back and forth from a process of working in the computer and then actually empirically producing physical models in the office to test out some of these shapes.
Right. It's really important to us to go from drawings like this to a built model very quickly, back and forth, each time, each one hopefully influencing the next stage. And so what you eventually get is, in the cellar plan, become the offices for the museum staff, plus a kitchen for an aphrodisiac cafe on the first level here. This is the Fifth Avenue entrance that brings you through the sort of gift shop and into a plasma screen elevator that will shoot you to the top of the building, where you then enter into a lecture hall that you would then be oriented to the museum. And then your typical gallery floors, you can see this kind of thickened space, not only to sort of set up zones where different exhibitions could be. You'd have temporary exhibitions here, permanent exhibitions along here, but you would move down through the building in the actual thickened facade of the building itself. And so this would be made up of 4 to 6 layers of structure, of materials that would be glass, translucent materials, and opaque materials, each one alternating so that sometimes there'd be double transparents, double opaques, transparent and opaque, and this mixture would occur so that as one moves down through the building, their body gets a new relationship not only to the museum and what's happening inside and a kind of idea or understanding about the exhibition, but also your body in relationship to the city. And the most important thing then is that when one sees the building as it's built, it's not something that you have to be ashamed of. It's not something that's behind a closed door. it's also not something that's totally out there in the open. There's this kind of play that occurs where there's like sexuality, sometimes you understand it, sometimes you don't, most of the times you're in the middle somewhere. Here, sometimes it's very clear to see into the museum, sometimes it's not. Most of the time it's a kind of blurring where the museum goers become the facade of the building itself. And then, again, bringing this out into building it with stereolithography models to study it further and further. And how it would look from different vantage points or entering from different streets. And the kind of final image of what we think would be, you know, a really important building in New York, because especially in the current political climate, it would be a way to say, its time has come, and this is a forum and a place for discussion to occur, and a place also to challenge some of the sort of zoning codes and the ways in which buildings are made in Manhattan. And so we're getting much closer to actually building it, and a lot of the other projects in the office we're actually using as research projects to begin to understand how we're going to construct this wall, how we're going to use the computer to help us to develop it, and it's getting very close to being a reality. So that's it. Thank you very much. If anyone would like questions, to ask some questions, we're happy to answer them.
And we're told to repeat them if they're asked.
Okay.
I was curious about the shift from the physical model stage back into the computer. Is there anything more that you could focus on about that?
The question was the shift from the physical model back into the computer? Specifically that translation, or okay? I mean, I would say it's a fairly communicative kind of formula going out of the computer into the built physical model, in the same way that we go from the physical model back into the computer, where it's really the architect, the author, saying, well, I think this is working, or I don't think this is working, or here's a place where we could take advantage of something else, and here's a place that we can't. Or it's very interesting, and I'm sure you guys are you're used to this. What you see on the screen and when you actually get it out into built form are usually fairly different things. And so I think that each one really influences the other, and that it's as important in both directions of that translation.
Also, to add to that is that as you're moving into the physical, you're starting to think more and more about constructability. And so the computer doesn't necessarily give you that sense right away as you're starting to develop the project. So you get into it physically. And you're also beginning to start to understand how to size things, how to assign materials to it. Then you go back into the computer and you start assigning those things as well. It's a back and forth process. Sometimes we don't get the shapes, the forms that are sort of responding here to the forces, the programmatic needs and stuff. In the models, we find that we get them better in the computer. They're more fluid, they're more seamless. And so it's a back and forth process. And we're finding, as we're starting to build more and more, that prototyping is another way that we also are able to get a little closer to making this connection between the computer and the real object much more real.
Any other questions? We've used Alias, Maya, Softimage, and MicroStation, depending on how we feel that day. No, I mean we've used a lot of different things, but mostly MicroStation. A lot of the kind of Animations and simulations are done in now currently Maya. In the past it's been Soft and Alias. And all of the working drawings for the office are done in MicroStation. Yes? Are you talking about the content of the museum or specifically the facade? There's actually a little known provision that allows you to use to extend architectural detail 14 inches over the street line. So we literally set that element into the computer as a kind of limit. And so that's why, you know, probably if we didn't have that limit, that thing would have blobbed out all over the place. Yeah. And so actually, the way we feel, the more constraints there are, the more effective the designs become, and the more interested we are in how we're resolving them using the technology, but also solving the problem for the client. As far as, I'll bring up this one other thing, even though I don't think this is what you were asking, but I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know how familiar you are with the current political climate in New York regarding sex establishments, but our mayor has pretty much eliminated them. He was never able to do it on a pornography charge or a First Amendment charge, or there was nothing like that. He was only able to do it through zoning variant, through a zoning change. And he was able to say that no, what's called an adult physical culture establishment could be within 500 feet of a church, a school, or an apartment building. Well, there's no place in all of New York City that's less than 500 feet from a church, a school, or an apartment building, and has effectively wiped out the sex culture industry in New York. This will not be an adult physical culture establishment. There are certain rules that have to apply. This has to be open to children, for example. And I don't think there'd be any reason that children shouldn't be allowed to go here. I think there will be some exhibits that might be, you know, rated R, but in general it's going to be really about sexuality as it relates to culture. That's the one problem. The other thing that he's been doing, for example, with the Sensation show at the Brooklyn Museum that some of you may have read about, that was all a problem of it being publicly funded. This museum is completely privately funded. So we've sort of set it up in the papers over the last few months where they immediately, when Sensation went through its problems, they immediately came to us and they said, you know, what do you think about this? And we said, well, that's public money and they have a right, I guess, to talk about public money, but our project is completely privately funded, and so if he's going to follow his own logic, it's not going to be a problem. And we didn't hear anything, so we think that's a good thing. Then
again, we could always take him up to the Met and show him as much pornography as we could.
That's true. So we don't think it's going to be a problem. Although it's a very interesting way to have to think about, you know, like we were saying, that there's this kind of thickened membrane that includes political forces. And I think that that's having an influence in the building, especially in its kind of transparency, that this is not something that you have to hide behind a door. This is something that should be open and discussed. No, that was just an early idea. I think it's probably going to go.
Actually, the zoning won't permit it.
That's our only problem with zoning, is signage. We would need a variance for signage for that large sign. So it probably will go. And it was not something that was terribly important to us either. I'm sorry, you go. Well, I think he'll be the senator or out of politics before this gets built, so we're not terribly worried. He hasn't taken a position on it yet. We've spoken to people in the administration, and they've basically said if it's not an adult physical culture establishment, it doesn't follow the zoning laws, and there are just certain rules, and as long as it's not publicly funded, they feel it's not going to be a problem at all. CNN did a poll, and they had 78% of the respondents said, great, we'd love to see it. You know, 19% said, it's just an excuse for pornography, and like another 4% said, of course, only in New York. something like that. So we feel pretty, you know, we hope we get enough protesters to sort of stir up some business.
Some funds.
But actually there are two churches within one block of the site, and both of them were interviewed in the Daily News about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And the one guy said, oh, it's disgusting, and you know, it's going to bring down the neighborhood values. And the other guy said, well, they seem to have a good take on it and that they're going to be doing it well, and let's face it, without sex, none of us would be here. And so, you know, if that's what the local priests are saying, we're not terribly worried about it. And I think, you know, and in a big way, I think, and this is something for, as architects, I mean, I really feel very proud of it, and the whole office feels proud of it, because not that this legitimizes it, but by giving them a kind of first-rate design and something that was really interesting and new, it's actually gotten a lot of press for the museum, and it kind of makes people say, like, yeah, this isn't in a dark, dingy hole, and that who knows who goes in there and what's going on. And so, you know, as an architect, if you can say to your client, look, we're doing a kind of adventurous design that we're not 100% sure about how it's going to come about, but it's really going to add value to your project, a client is much more likely to be supportive of your ideas, and these clients are, and they really see that the value of architecture and the value of design is making their project happen. It's a good way to get away with buildings like that, I guess.
Yeah. Are there any jokes going around about this museum you might share with us?
Any what?
Jokes.
Jokes or anecdotes about dealing with the public?
No, the only thing that I could say would be a joke is that their slogan is "Make time for Mo Sex," which I think is a great slogan. For you know, instead of MoMA, it's Mo Sex.
That and our parents didn't believe that we were actually doing a museum of Mo Sex until they saw the building report we had been working on for a couple months, and then they actually believed that we were actually working on such a museum.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, there's the occasional snicker, but I think people are kind of beyond that at this point. I think everyone's saying it's time for something like this. You know, there are 5 erotica museums in Europe. I guess there's 2 in like Hamburg, Berlin, Amsterdam, Paris, and Barcelona or Madrid. I can't remember which one. But they're really erotica museums. They're collections of objects mostly. This is very different. This is a forum for guest artists to come in and curate shows. This will be about sex as it relates to culture, to food, to fashion, to play. It's really a very different kind of venue. And we're pretty excited about it. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for having us out here. Turn your thing off before you talk.
Who gets this on button? You hold that for a second. There you go. Oh, great. Thanks a lot.